Now, it's been a bad week for ignorant and hurtful comments about the Holocaust. It started off with the idiotic remarks from Whoopi Goldberg on The View, where she suggested that the Holocaust was not racially motivated.
It's not about race.
Ethnicity.
Well, they
No,
consider
it's
Jews
about
a different race.
But it's not about race. It's not about
Well,
race.
what is it about?
Because it's about man's inhumanity to man. That's what it's about.
But it's about white supremacy. It's
Well,
about
but
going
it's not-
after
it's
Jews
not about
and
ideal race.
gypsies
It's
and
but these are two
Romas.
white groups of people.
Her rationale: the Jews were white and so were the Nazis. In a rare example of the left facing any consequences, Goldberg was suspended by the US ABC network for 2 weeks following widespread outcry about her remarks. But there are plenty of examples where worse treatment, where someone was sacked for saying the equivalent about Black Americans or people of other ethnicities. Also this week, Amnesty International declared Israel an apartheid state. This is the same organisation that struggles or fails to call out the litany of human rights abuses in China and other places, and yet it's labelled the one democracy in the Middle East an apartheid state. Thankfully, there has once again been widespread condemnation of Amnesty's decision, including here in Australia, with the Prime Minister reaffirming our support and commitment to Israel. Joining me now to discuss this is Executive Director of United Nations Watch and international human rights lawyer, Hillel Neuer. Hillel, so great to have you on the program again. Thank you for joining me. Let's start.
My pleasure.
Let's start with the Whoopi Goldberg issue. I mean, we saw Megyn Kelly was dumped by her network for blackface comments, but Whoopi Goldberg hasn't been dumped. She's been suspended. Do you think there's a double standard here in how issues related to anti-Semitism are treated?
Yes, I think you've articulated clearly a double standard when something in the past few years has been said by a celebrity that remotely has been seen to be pejorative against Blacks or gays or women or certain other minorities. They've been fired immediately. Here we have a very bizarre statement made about the Holocaust, that the Holocaust wasn't about racism when Hitler spoke his entire time about a master race, about Jews being the inferior race. And as you indicated, she's merely gets a suspension. Look, I don't know that anyone needs to be fired in these cases. I don't know that Whoopi Goldberg needs to be suspended or fired. She needs to learn something. And this ought to be a teachable moment, which is that there is a strange discourse in America about race. And obviously, the Nazis spoke entirely about racism. And for them, there was a master race, there was an inferior race. They had the Nuremberg laws about who couldn't marry Jews. And so it indeed seemed very ignorant. And I hope that rather than her being suspended or fired, that she learned something about the Holocaust. Whoopi Goldberg said she's never gonna talk about it again. She said, this is what I meant, and people understood something else. So I'm never gonna talk about it again. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is for Whoopi Goldberg to understand what the Nazis were all about and what motivated them. And in their ideology, it was about what they called race.
Exactly. And you think she would be more careful given she chose her own name. She chose a Jewish name, Goldberg. Her original name, I think, was Karen Elaine or something like that. Now, Hillel, I want to ask you about this Amnesty International report released that declares Israel an apartheid state. Why is there this fixation with Israel and a complete failure to call out other authoritarian regimes?
I think it's an excellent question, and indeed it was posed to two of the leaders of Amnesty. Agnes Callamard is the new Secretary General of Amnesty. She used to be at the Human Rights Council past couple of years, and one of her senior officials, a gentleman named Philip Luther, the head of their Middle East advocacy. And they were both interviewed by the Times of Israel by Lazar Berman. And it was a rather lengthy interview. And he asked them the question that you just posed now: why, of all the countries in the world, did they choose Israel to accuse of this novel accusation of being an apartheid state. They have a 200-page report where they purport to show a legal definition of an apartheid state, and they try to make the case that Israel qualifies under this legal definition. They haven't applied it, haven't even tried to apply it to China, which is herding 1 million Uyghur Muslims in camps, which is openly trying to destroy their culture and their language. You can go to Israel and you will hear the mosques, the call to prayer several times a day at 4 a.m. in Jerusalem. You will hear the loud call to prayer of the mosques. You will walk in the streets of Jerusalem in Israel, and you will see women with hijabs walking freely. You will see Arab doctors in hospitals and Arab pharmacists and lawyers and judges. It's not perfect. There's things to criticize. But the notion that the only democracy in the Middle East, which has a Supreme Court that overrules government decisions in favor of minorities, that has free and fair elections, that has freedom of the press, that has more rights and freedoms for Arabs than any other Arab country in the Middle East. The notion that that should be singled out for apartheid and not China, or how Turkey treats the Kurds, or how Syria treats its minorities, or Mauritania where there's slavery. They were asked this question and they couldn't answer it. They couldn't answer the question. It seems like some kind of obsession with Israel. And I'll just note that the people who've embraced this report include the terrorist groups Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which are funded by Iran. They hailed this report. I went on the Hamas website. You can read it. And Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party who was suspended for anti-Semitism, he embraced the report. I think that says a lot, Sharri.
It does. Absolutely shocking. Look, just very quickly, we're almost out of time, but I just want to ask you about some of the figures we've seen turn up to greet Xi Jinping at the Beijing Olympics. One of them, the World Health Organization Director General Tedros. Of course, you know, no comments from him about human rights abuses, no comments from him about getting any transparency or cooperation from China in terms of an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, yet he turns up for the opening of the Winter Olympics. Very quickly, what is the point of bodies like the WHO if they don't represent us or help us have a healthier and safer world?
Look, I think you've hit the needle on the head. The world, you would think we're facing a global pandemic, which is, infecting people around the world. We need a functioning, effective, credible World Health Organization. And sadly, Dr. Tedros, as you know, because you've covered this issue more than anyone, 2 years ago when the pandemic began, he was praising China to the skies, saying how wonderful Xi Jinping was. I just tweeted out some screenshots of his tweets where he said, Xi Jinping, we just met at the end of January 2020. He's doing an amazing job. He's so transparent. While Xi Jinping was covering up what was happening in Wuhan, while he was, silencing people, summoning the Dr. Li Wenliang in the middle of the night because he dared to speak out. So sadly, certain international organizations seem to be in the pocket of the communist regime. And Dr. Tedros has done a little better recently on, challenging China a little bit, but his decision to go to Beijing now, as well as Antonio Guterres, the head of the United Nations, I think is very sad. It's not the United Nations that we deserve.
No, 100%. Hillel, Neuer, you always have such sensible comments, and it's a breath of fresh air. Thank you very much for joining me.